Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here tonight. My name is Elana Arnold. I am a writer. I've written a number of books. Gosh, what is that number? It's right around 20, I believe. Everything from it's a number. Everything from picture books through young adult novels. Everything from 250 words to 120,000 words, depending on the project. So actually, I have two examples here today. The Blood Years, which I'm going to talk about, and also a book that's coming out in January called The Fisher's Small Wishes. And I just got the author copies today in the mail, so I thought I'd bring it along because this is a book about my grandmother and her grandfather. And this is, in a way, also a book about my grandmother and her grandfather. I could probably write about my grandmother for the rest of my life. So today I'm here to talk with you, and I'm very grateful that you're here to talk with you about this book called The Blood Years. This is my debut historical fiction novel, and it's more than that. It's also what I've made of the stories my grandmother shared with me about being a Jewish teenager in Chernovitz, Romania during World War II and the Holocaust. Though my Nana told me many things, and I knew there was a story to write, in order to craft a novel, I had to do deep research into the complex and unique history of her particular region, other survivors' narratives, creative work produced by the survivors, scholarly works about the events that transpired in and around Chernovitz, Romania, and much, much more. Imagine that someone gives you a precious plate and it shatters. Now imagine dropping that plate into the shards of 6 million shattered plates. Some radically different from your plate, some nearly identical. Can you ever put the plate you were given back together again? Most likely no. But what you can do is sift gently and delicately and reverently through the shards, finding as many pieces of your plate as you can, and collecting other sharp-edged, beautiful, terrible pieces as well. And then you can take all of these pieces and sit with them for many years. And then you do your very best to make something with them. A mosaic. A piece of art that honors the original plate, even if it cannot be salvaged. That finds a way to make art from so many beautiful, terrible, priceless things. That's what writing this book felt like. It's my Nana's story, but it's also the story of many other Chernovitzers who endured the Holocaust and the pogroms before, and also those who perished. I always knew that both of my grandparents had survived the Holocaust. My grandfather in Poland, my grandmother in Romania. Here I am with them celebrating my college graduation. They met and married after the war. I learned about concentration camps in school, and when I asked my Nana if she'd been in prison, she said, "Not exactly." What I didn't understand for many years was that the experience of Jews and Roma and disabled and queer people in Romania was different from the stories made popular in American literature, media, and history books. There were no concentration camps exactly in Romania, but that absolutely didn't mean that there was no Holocaust. Instead, there was a systemic, slow erasure of Jewish rights and protections that began before the war and amplified throughout, resulting in the Jewish residents losing their status as citizens, their right to do business, the corralling of the Jewish population into an inhumanely small and unsanitary ghetto, and waves of brutal deportations and murders. In the Blood Years, I chose to call the city what my grandmother called it, Chernovitz, though it's gone by different names depending on who's in charge. As my character Rika says, we call the city by her maiden name, Chernovitz, rather than Cernuti, the name Romanians thrust upon her when they took her from Austria after the Great War. The war years in Chernovitz, Romania, and the fate of its Jewish population have not been extensively written about. It should be common knowledge that Romania is the country that killed the most Jews of any other country except Nazi Germany. Even before the war, there was a long history of Romanian anti-Semitism and violent attacks on Jews. During World War II, over 400,000 Jews were murdered in the Romanian-controlled areas. Unlike Germany, Romania has not done the work of acknowledging and remembering its terrible history. In fact, during communism, the Romanian government blocked access to and even destroyed archival material and deflected all blame onto Nazi Germany. It was only after the fall of communism that archives were slowly opened and remaining artifacts began to be accessed. This process is still ongoing, and most people are still unfamiliar with the history in this region and the extent of the murders. Here's a map of the region before the wars, when Črnovice was still part of Romania. It looks different now. So this is Bukovina. This is the area that my grandmother's city was. And it's in Romania. And you can see here it's got Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Hungary. It's in Poland. I think I said Poland. So it's quite the hub. Here's a more current map. You can see that Črnovice is now part of Ukraine. Right here is Črnovice. It's part of Ukraine. So when I was doing my research for this book, I planned to go to Črnovice, but the Russians invaded. And there's a character in this book, the grandfather, who says everything is cyclical. And this was a very strange cyclical moment when I realized I couldn't go to the town that my grandmother lived to study how the Russians had invaded because the Russians were busy invading. I also couldn't go because of COVID and this terrible, cough that people were getting as I was writing about my grandmother becoming more and more seriously ill with tuberculosis as the war went on. So it was a very surreal experience. So this is what happened. I'll talk about the book too, but I'm talking about the history a little bit first. After World War I and the collapse of Austria-Hungary, the area around Črnovice, called Northern Bukovina, was awarded to Romania. At the time, ethnic Romanians made up only about a quarter of Črnovice's 112,000 people. Jews constituted the biggest group, at least 27% of Črnovice's population, according to the 1930 census, and the city was considered to be a relatively safe haven for them. Other large groups include Germans, Ukrainians, and Poles. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939 to start World War II, the Soviet Union used the invasion as a pretext to occupy northern Bukovina, including Črnovice. Then in 1940, Romania joined forces with Hitler. When the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Nazis and their Romanian allies quickly overran northern Bukovina and Črnovice. The Germans arrived in the city in early July of that year and transferred control of the area back to Romania. The Romanians generally bent over backwards to carry out the anti-Jewish policies of their German allies. After all, they had hundreds of years of practice. They stripped Jewish citizens of their rights and property. The city's 50,000 Jewish residents were forced to move into a sealed ghetto. Many residents died from inhumane conditions inside the ghetto, and waves of Jewish prisoners were transferred from the ghetto to extermination camps, not exactly concentration camps. It was an area mostly called Transnistria, mostly where people were basically just sent just to starve and die of disease, lack of clean water and the elements. Thousands died en route, and those who survived were left to die of starvation, weather, and disease. So they weren't necessarily forced to stay, but there was nowhere to go. It was the middle of nowhere, and there was nothing. It wasn't until after I published my first novel that Nena filled in some of the gaps in the war stories I'd heard. Hearing what she finally shared, I understood why. When I was young, she'd edited out the worst of things to spare me from them. Though she'd shared stories about her family life that are in this book, going to the countryside with her grandfather for the summer where she was chased by geese, her mean as a snake but incredible older sister Astrid, their attendance at a ballet academy, and the relationships made there. Near the end of her life, she trusted me with much more of it. The complex relationships between her mother and her father, her sister and her lover, herself and a man who both provided for her and abused her, and what happened to her beloved grandfather. But I'll bet, knowing her, even then she held back some of her most painful remembrances as an act of love. And she hoped that someday I could use her experiences in a book. Just name the character Fredrika, she told me. I've always liked that name. This is a photograph of my grandmother on the right, Frida, who is Fredrika in the book, and Astrid in the middle, who goes by Astra in the book, and their mother, Anna, who is Anna in the book. I just love her little chubby arm so much. And I love how her sister is clearly the center of the universe, which is a major theme in the book. This is my great-great-grandfather, Heinrich Fischmann, Anna's father. And these 4 people are the models for the main characters in the Blood Years. What's funny to me, too, is this book is a picture book that I have coming out in January. It's called The Fish of Small Wishes. And I brought it today. The author copy's just arrived, which I found to be serendipitous. Because this is, let's see where it says. It's an original fairy tale that I wrote because my daughter asked me for a bedtime story, and this came to me. And I told her this story several years ago, and I just thought I made it up. But of course I didn't, because none of us make anything up. We're always just sort of reaching back into this stew of memory. So maybe I'll just read you the author's note for this, because this is where the story came from. So I'll read you a little bit from the author's note. Because it's interesting, because terrible things happen in the Blood Years. It's a beautiful book, and I'm very proud of it, but it's also, it's a Holocaust book, so it's a hard book. But this, you can take the same sort of love and the same set of people, and many, many things can be created from that. So this book, too, came from that. So when I was very young, my grandmother, whom we called Nena, told me a story about how, when she was very young, her grandfather was once in charge of shopping for Passover dinner. One of his duties was to get a carp to make gefilte fish, a dish that combined several kinds of fish with matzo meal, spices, and sometimes eggs, all rolled into balls. So he went to the fishmonger and brought home a thrashing, glittery, living fish. A carp, you see, is a bottom feeder. It spends most of its time in muck and mud. To be fit for the meal, the fish needed to be cleaned inside and out. This meant it would have to take a bath, a very long bath, in the family's bathtub. Nena's grandfather filled the tub with water and plopped in the carp. For the next 2 days, my Nena watched that fish swim in slow circles back and forth. But Nena's grandfather was a big softy. When it came time to eat the carp, he didn't have the heart. So instead of taking the fish to the kitchen, he took it out of the family's apartment altogether, spiriting it back to its watery home. No gefilte fish for Passover, but that was fine by my Nena. I grew up loving this tale, imagining the fish in the bathtub, picturing the face of my great-great-grandfather, whom I never knew, and the face of my Nena as a little girl. One night, many years later, my own little girl asked me to tell her a bedtime story. I cast deep into the murky waters of my memory, and up came a fish in a bathtub. This story, like all my stories, is a gefilte fish of sorts. One part Jewish memory, one part what if, and one part dream. And then it says, I wonder, what stories do you have inside of you? So I wrote that about this sweet little picture book, but it's true about this too. It's memory, and it's me, and it's what if, which is where I think all art comes from. So I thought I'd share that with you. So here we have my Nena, Frida Teitler. She wrote her name here, Teitler. And her big sister Astrid, when they were school age. This is, about where you meet them in the book, a little bit younger than this. And then here they were as teenagers, maybe right after the war. It's hard to say exactly when these pictures were taken. Young women. Okay. So The Blood Years is the story of my Nena's teenage years in Chernovitz, Romania, before and during World War II. It's a love story about sisters. It's about ballet and bears and the ways our families can fail us. It's a book about the great and terrible things people do in the name of love. And it's my attempt to do with my Nena's gift of stories what I try to do with all of my work, to transform pain into art, to embrace ambiguity, and to find beauty even in the ugliest of moments. And that is what The Blood Years is. It was over 10 years of work from when I first thought I wanted to write this story. And even before that, it was a lifetime of work, of listening to my grandmother's stories, of her work, of her willing to be vulnerable and to share her stories with me, of her telling me her stories cyclically, the funny stories first, and then waiting for me to ask questions. Like, but wait a minute, why were you living with your grandfather? Where was your dad? Well, let me tell you about my father and what a philanderer he was. And she told me a little bit more, but she told it to me in a way that made it kind of funny. And then, but weren't you hungry when you didn't have any food? Well, actually, yes, we were. And so the stories would get deeper and deeper the more I asked, the more she gave. She was incredibly generous. And that's actually one piece of advice I would give to anybody who wants their stories to be remembered, which I think is all of us, is to be vulnerable and to share your stories with your children and your grandchildren, and not just the stories that make you heroic. My grandfather was a wonderful man too, but he couldn't stand to tell any stories in which he didn't come off as the hero. The stories where he was brave and strong and handsome, and so I don't have very many stories, and they were all sort of a little bit fantasy feeling because they were, cleaned up for me. Whereas my grandmother told me stories about what she observed. She wasn't always the center of her stories. And so that actually was a real challenge in writing this book, is that the main character had a hard time being the center of the book, because so much of what I knew was about what happened to her sister and what happened to her, this girl Ruth at the dance studio. And so my job with this book was complex, because I had the main events of my grandmother's life that were like the tent poles in this story. But then you have to make a novel. And so sometimes you got to move things around a little bit for dramatic effect. But it seemed really deeply important to me that I didn't make stuff up about the Holocaust. I didn't want to invent trauma or pain. And so it was important to me that everything that happens to the characters in this book on a sort of a historic scale, things that happened with Russians, with Nazis, with rape, with murder, that those things all happened, either to my grandmother or to another survivor who recorded their story. I read extensively through a series of memoirs, so then I would take and fictionalize things and give them to my character. That's what I say when I said I made a mosaic. Or I listened to so many testimonials through the Holocaust Memorial Museum's incredible database. There's a story about halfway through where the grandfather, Opa, is taken along with Marcel, who you'll get to know. All the men are taken, and the girls don't know where they went. And when they come back, they tell their story of what had happened to them. And that story is a version of a story of a man to whom this actually happened, this scene. So none of this, not everything in the story necessarily happened to my grandmother, but it all happened to a Chernivtsian. Even the dreams in my book are real. So in my research, I came across a book called The Third Reich of Dreams. It was a collection of dreams that Jews were having in Germany in the early years of the war. I have an extensive reading list at the back of the book, so you can look up the books that I referenced. Let me find I want to get the name right of this book here. The Third Reich of Dreams, The Nightmares of a Nation, 1933 to 1939. Charlotte Barat was, I think, a psychology student who thought, gee, I don't believe she was Jewish. The dreams Jews are having are really interesting right now. It's this Freudian sort of stuff. And so she wrote them down, and then she secreted them out of Germany. And they weren't translated into English until 1968, and the book is out of print. But I had to find a copy. And I tracked one down at the University of California, Davis, and I did something you're not supposed to do. I photocopied the whole book so I could read it, because I couldn't buy it. It was like $400 to buy a copy on eBay. It's out of print. But anyway, the dreams my main character has are all versions of the dreams that Jews were the actual dreams that actual Jewish people were having during those years. Fictionalized to work in my story, but taken from those dreams. So in that way, it felt to me that this was my attempt to bear witness to what had happened, not just to my grandmother, but to her city and to sort of Eastern Europe through the lens of what I had to offer, which with all of my work in the young adult space is about the female body, the cisgendered female body, since that's what mine is and my experience has been, and the sort of the grossness of being in a body, and sort of the unsafeness of growing up in conventionally attractive cisgendered female body in a world that's not built for your safety, especially in Germany or in Europe during the war. Jews in general weren't even people. So if a girl's bodily autonomy, as I'm sure you can imagine, is even less secure than it was in 1990s Laguna Hills for me. So, but like I said, all of my work is 1/3 me, at least 1/3 things outside of me, in this case my grandmother and the stories of others, and 1/3 what if, which is that sort of amazing sort of magic of writing, is that who knows where that what if comes from. So I thought I would read to you from the book if you'd like, and then I would be very happy to answer any questions you have about research or about writing or about the business of writing, anything you want to ask me. I am here to answer. All right? So let's see here. I usually read the beginning, but I thought maybe I'd read you chapter 2 just because I thought you might be interested in the history, and I sort of told you the dry history, and this is sort of me taking that history and putting it into scene, so you can see what that looks like. So chapter 2 is called The Way Things Are, and this is from part 1, which is called Astra and Her Lover. Opa is the grandfather, Astra is the sister. I think that's all you need to know. Before we moved in with Opa, Astra was the one person I could count on. She ran hot and cold, sure, but that didn't mean she didn't love me. After Opa rescued us from our dank apartment, I had 2 people I could trust. At home, Opa made sure there was food on the table and that we went to bed on time, whether or not Mama was having one of her headaches, whether or not she joined us to eat or to help us get ready for bed. And everywhere else, there was Astra. At school, when Dee Dee Lieberman made me cry by teasing me about how Father had abandoned us, Astra cut her down in front of everyone by saying, "We might not know where our Father is, but at least we know who he is." That shut Dee Dee up. On the street, if a boy looks at me in a way Astra doesn't like, she'll screw up her beautiful face into an ugly mask and spit in his direction. She might be hard on me from time to time, but that's just the way Astra is. Sometimes she gets jealous if my attention goes away from her. Once when I was about 10 years old, I started to get really into pressing flowers. It was neat to me the way you could preserve them, and for a little while it was all I talked about. The interesting specimen I'd found at the entrance to the Volksgarten, the sort of bluebell I'd never seen before. A variety of posies that were planted in front of our school. 3 times a day I checked on the delicate blossoms I'd sandwiched between newsprint and tucked into the heaviest book I could find, other than Opa's Bible, which he suggested maybe we should just leave to God. I worried about fungus over dinner, chatted on the way to school about how I might display the flowers once they were dry, until one morning when I went to see how things were progressing, only to find the book stripped of the flowers and returned to the shelf. The newsprint, crumpled, was shoved carelessly into the rubbish bin. The flowers were torn. I was upset, of course. The flowers were something I cared about. But Astra made it up to me. After the incident with the flowers, she started taking more of an interest in my dancing, giving me tips after class and helping me with extra calisthenics on the weekends, holding my feet as I did sit-ups on our bedroom floor. A few dried flowers in exchange for an extra measure of my sister's attention was a good trade, in my opinion, even if I did quietly mourn the loss of my hobby. Opa likes to say that everything is cyclical, and I've seen that to be true with Astra. She might spin away, off to other interests and other friends, but she always spins back in to me. Is it fair that Astra can have her separate interests and secrets, but I cannot? No, of course it isn't. But it's the way things are with Astra, and for better or worse, she's my favorite person in the world. I try to keep all of this in mind as I get dressed after dance class. Astra's waiting for me just inside the door to the street. I've dressed as fast as I could, but one of my stockings eluded me. I found it finally, shoved in the pocket of my coat. She's impatient, foot tapping, as if I didn't spend an hour of my afternoon waiting for her to appear after school. There you are. She opens the door and gestures, the grand sweep of her arm implying that I'm the lollygagger and she's just my humble servant. I could say something smart, but then we're on the street, walking side by side. She slips her arm into the crook of mine. Our steps fall into sync, and I'm glad I didn't. Dance ends early on Fridays because even though Madame Lucia isn't Jewish, about 1/3 of her students are. It's late fall, and though it's only 10 minutes past 3 o'clock, the sun will be gone within the hour. Astra and I go together up the Herrengasse toward home. Next door to the dance studio is the milliner's shop, and Miss Rosen is just coming down to lock up for the evening. She'll wait for Madame Lucia to join her, and then the 2 of them will go home to the apartment they rent together as housemates. She nods to us. "Good evening, girls," she says, and we respond together, "Good evening." Today she's wearing the thick fur cap, the first time she's donned it this year. It means the cold weather is here to stay, and that soon there will be snow. You can set the seasons by Miss Rosen's choice of hat, and everyone knows it. Her window display is shadowed now, but I can make out the shapes of disembodied mannequin heads, turned this way and that, each with its own hat, all crafted by Miss Rosen's clever hands. The peanut vendor is on the corner with his cart, and maybe by way of apologizing to me, Astra pulls out a coin to buy us some. He takes a square paper from his stack, rolls its end to make a cone, and fills a metal scoop with hot, fragrant peanuts, pouring them expertly into the cone, not one peanut lost. He hands it to Astra, and she thanks him in Ruthenian. As soon as he's pocketed the coin, he begins to close his cart for the day. He's got a way to travel to get home to his village, and though he looks smart in his tall black boots, his white linen shirt, and colorful embroidered vest, he really should have brought a warmer coat. The peanuts are delicious, so hot that I have to hold them loose in my mouth for a moment before I can bite them open, salty and just a bit sweet. This walk is almost as familiar to me as the route from our shared bedroom to Opa's kitchen. So many times have I walked it. When I was 8 and Opa first signed me up for dance, Astra hadn't been happy about it. Dance was hers, she complained. It stung that she didn't want me there. Anyway, there's no point in her joining now, she argued. She's too old to be any good. Still, Opa signed me up, and now, 5 years later, this walk home is my favorite part of the day, because even as Astra and I have gotten busier with school and dance and friends, this walk has remained just the two of us together. Our arms are still linked. I tighten my elbow to squeeze her arm, and she squeezes mine in return. I toss another handful of peanuts into my mouth. They taste just the same as peanuts have always tasted, even though the street we bought them on looks a little different lately. A few months ago, Germany and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, basically agreeing to stay out of each other's way, I guess. And then on the 1st of September, just 2 weeks before I turned 13, Hitler invaded our neighbor Poland. Great Britain and France declared war on Germany in retaliation, and some Jewish families here in town have decided that they want to move away. Back and forth, it's like a dance, a scary one. Things get 2 steps worse and then 1 step better. There was an awful time a couple of years ago when 2 politicians, Octavian Goga and Alexandru Cuza, took over the government and promised to solve the Jewish problem. That phrase sends a cold shiver up my spine every time I hear it. A lot of people were hurt, and restrictions were put into place having to do with citizenship and what sort of jobs Jews were allowed to have. That was when Astra and I had to change from public school to private because Jewish kids weren't allowed anymore. But then, too, what Opa says about cycles seemed to be true. After just a couple of months, Goga and Kuza were forced to step down. Not everything went back to normal. All the restrictions stayed in place. But at least things stopped getting worse, unlike in Germany. We've heard about how they're incarcerating and deporting their Jewish residents, and the terrible looting and destruction of Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, even graveyards. Lots of people in Chernovitz say we should count ourselves lucky that we live here, where things are mostly normal. And Opa insists things will settle again, the way they always have before. You girls just concentrate on your studies and dance and leave politics to the adults, he tells us. Mostly, I'm glad to obey. If Opa says things will be all right, I believe him. He's the wisest person I know, after all. Some of the shops on the Herrengasse have recently closed. The fishmonger storefront is vacant, and so is the cobbler's shop, 3 doors down. Their blacked-out windows are like teeth missing from a smile. Still, the delicatessen, the butcher, and the dairy shop are all where they should be, windows loaded with delights, and so I shake more peanuts into my mouth and concentrate on what's in front of me rather than what's gone away, the way Opa is always telling me to do. Astra's earlier expression returns unbidden to my mind. I want to ask her about it and about why she wasn't at school this afternoon, where she'd gone, who she'd been with. I want to ask, but I also sort of don't want to, because I don't think I'll like the answer. Wherever she was, whatever she was doing, he has put my sister in a high mood. She walks quickly and she whistles as we go, and though she bought the peanuts for us to share, she only eats a few, her mind elsewhere. Just on this simple walk home from dance, you can see the city's complex layers if you know how to look and how to listen. As long as a Romanian officer isn't present over here, we call the city by her maiden name, Chernovitz, rather than Cernuti, the name Romanians thrust upon her when they took her from Austria after the Great War. The street signs are in Romanian, but everyone I know still uses the German names. Ruthenian must be spoken to the vendors who come into the city to sell fruits and vegetables or to work in domestic service. You hear Ukrainian here and there, German in the homes of those of us with Austrian roots, Jews and Christians alike, Hebrew in the synagogue when Opa drags us along for high holidays, and in the Jewish-owned shops, Yiddish. Ours is a great and varied city, known far and wide as Little Vienna because of all the universities, the emphasis on arts and culture. Outside the city limits, in the countryside and in other less educated towns, It's true that there's anti-Semitic violence coming and going like waves lapping the shore. It's terrible, but it's the way things have always been. And Opa says that for a Jew, there's no better place in Eastern Europe than Chernovitz. Still, over the past few years, the people who've left have one thing in common. They're all Jewish. We arrive at our building, and like always, I feel a rush of fondness for it. It's nothing fancy. In fact, it looks just about the same as most of the other apartment buildings. 4 stories tall, made of large gray blocks, a small front staircase, 5 steps up to the door. But of course, it's not the building I'm so fond of. It's what's inside. And that is part of the book. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's interesting to me. I always forget to mention that when I wrote this, it was really hard to write for lots of reasons, some of which I'm sure you can imagine, some of which is technically difficult. And then there were decisions to be made, like, should it be first person or third person? I wrote a whole book once called Red Hood that's written entirely in second person, which was really fun. Everything is you. But deciding, what perspective, it was very hard to have my character not sound like someone who was safe later telling me a story the way my Nana had told it to me. So I made the decision to write it in present tense, which I think also, unfortunately, I think structure is a really great way to show sort of what the theme of a book is or what the themes are. And one I think of the sort of thematic cores of this book is the cyclicality of history and anti-Semitism. And so putting the book in present tense made it happening now, not just happening in the past. So, every choice, how to have them pay for the peanuts. It's very difficult because money was so weird then, because the Romanians, there was Romanian money, but the people also paid in other sorts of cash. And then how much did peanuts cost? It was hard to find out those sorts of details. I had a reader who was incredibly helpful. Her name is Ruth Glassberg Gold. I finally got to meet her in person, actually. She's a Chernovitz survivor. I read her memoir called Ruth's Journey. It's a memoir about her childhood and teen years and young adult years before, during, and after the Holocaust. Her entire family died in Transnistria, one of those camps I was telling you about. She was the only survivor. So after I read her book, I was working on mine. I wrote to her and asked her if I could have a phone call with her. And this was about a year and a half after my grandmother had died. And it was the most strange and beautiful experience when she answered the phone and I heard her voice, because I'd always known that my Nana had an accent. We used to love to make fun of her because she couldn't say 3. She said tree. But I knew German was her main language, but I didn't really understand that she didn't have a German accent. My Nana had a Chernivitzian accent, which was this strange, unique stew of having been raised speaking German, Yiddish, Ruthenian, Romanian, and then Russian. She had learned Russian very quickly. And so she had this accent that I didn't realize was so specific until Ruth answered her phone in my Nana's accent. And it was a gift given to me, to be able to hear this accent again and understand what it was. So anyway, I was just in Florida and I got to meet Ruth a few days ago, and she made me a Schmettentort, which is it's a Chernivitzian special. It's a sour cream cake that I hadn't had since my Nana had died, so it was pretty amazing. Anyway, Ruth could answer lots of questions for me. I paid her. You should always pay people for their work, especially when you're asking them to do difficult things. She read my book for me. The reason this is a 4-story apartment building is I put them in a 6-story building. And she said, "Oh, what, are you ridiculous? There were no buildings that were 6 stories tall. No one lived in 6-story buildings." So, okay, thank you, Ruth. She fixed so many things for me like that, and is just an incredible resource and has become a dear friend as well. So, there's like every single detail has so many stratifications of research and memory that. It's funny when I open the book and I read a page and I think about all the reasons why I made a decision in one line, and there's usually at least 3 or 4 reasons for each of those decisions. So it was a lot of work. Does anybody have any questions or anything they'd like to say? Yes.
Why did you decide to
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I was always a reader. I was a weird, lonely, sad, scared kid. I was neuroatypical, but didn't know that at the time. I just knew I didn't know how to make friends. I used to wish people would walk around with like, you know how in cartoons they walk around with like bubbles over their heads and you can see what they're thinking. And I used to think, God, why don't, if people would just do that, then I would know what they wanted. Then I could do the thing they wanted and then they would be my friend, which of course is a complicated, not great way to want to live your life, but that's another layer of story. But people were my favorite animal. They always have been, but they terrified and eluded me. And so books were a place where people made sense because you hear their thoughts, right? You get to hear their thoughts. And books were a comfort. We moved a lot. I had an unstable home. My Nana and Papa's house was my one stable home of my childhood. My parents' home was not. And so I always had a book with me, and it would be the thing I would disappear into at school, or when my parents were fighting, or when I was, in the backseat of the car waiting for however knows how long. So, I mean, I always knew that the best thing in the world was reading. So it seemed to me that writing would be even better. I'm grossly maladapted to do most anything else. I'm a pretty good teacher, but I just always wanted to be a writer. So, but it took me a long time. It was not a straightforward, easy, finish a book at 21 and then get published story. But that's okay. Yeah. The name sounds kind of familiar, but it might just be that I came across Levy's in my research. Does he? Okay. I don't think so. Is he local? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Yeah. No, I did come across this wonderful resource, a listserv, which I didn't know listservs still were a thing. I found a listserv of Chernovitz survivors and their descendants, which a listserv, it's basically like an email that you can join that, you get a whole, whenever anyone posts, you get, so I thought Facebook killed the listserv, but apparently no, they still exist. So it was an incredibly cool resource because I was able to ask questions there, and sometimes people had answers. They helped me find my some records with my family's names, like where they lived, the street they lived on, things like that. Most of my family's records were destroyed. Most everything in Chernovitz was, but there were some public records left with their names. I can't tell you offhand. I'd have to. Yeah, was it in Bukovina? No, so Bukovina was like the region. Northern Bukovina is the region where she lived. So, yeah, didn't become Ukraine until after World War II. Anybody else? Yeah, Penny. Oh gosh, smallest details. I spent a lot of time researching how exactly a pneumothorax machine works, which is a machine you use to collapse a lung. I knew that my grandmother had tuberculosis, and that they did this thing where they basically put a needle in her chest and pulled out the air to collapse her lungs so it could rest. And I knew that it was done without any anesthetic because all the anesthetic was saved for the non-Jewish hospital. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how that would feel. I don't know if that's the smallest detail. I also spent a lot of time learning stuff about ballet. They're ballerinas. So those are a couple of the things that I spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time looking for articles. So every news article that's in here is real. And one of the things that was really satisfying about this book was that so there's someone in this book who dies, who was a musician and wasn't a main character in the book at all. It was just a death that started some things happening. And in revision, I realized I could make him be the old pianist at their dance studio. So that they get this new pianist who is a bigger character. So that way so that sort of manipulation of how do I take something that really happened? This guy really was a musician. He really could have been a pianist at a dance studio. and work it into the sort of like the fictional world, so that she would have more of an investment in his death than if it was just a stranger in the newspaper article. So that's a different sort of place I spent time. And I'm very synesthetic. I can feel the shape of my story. And so it really felt like taking different threads and taking a knitted object and then reaching, how many layers down do you reach with this one red thread to make it have sort of more texture. So those are some of the things I spent time on. Yeah.
My first wife was Holocaust survivor.
No, I wasn't aware of that group. In fact, there's so much that I don't know. Like, I mean, I would say my knowledge is deep rather than wide. I know a lot about my grandmother, and I know a lot about how tuberculosis was treated in 1941, if you were a Jew. And I know a lot about Chernovitz, but I don't. And I mean, of course, I've read quite a bit about the Holocaust in the larger scheme of things. But no, the more I go and talk about my book, the more aware I am. I'm humbled of how much I don't know, because I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist. But one thing I can tell you is that I was recently in Virginia. I was on a book launch for a book tour, and I had 200 eighth graders. And I was like, this is my book. And, it was they had to come. It was like a book festival. So they weren't necessarily interested in me or my book. They were just glad they had a day off school. And so I started talking. I said, the Holocaust. And I looked at their faces and I realized they're not getting like anything, right? So I said, let me just stop and ask a question. Like, raise your hand if you've heard of the Holocaust. I'd say just under 50% of the people in the room, maybe 40% of the kids raised their hand. These are eighth graders in Virginia. And then I said, okay, well, raise your hand if you've heard of Adolf Hitler. I'd say about 60%, maybe. So they're like, oh, like maybe I've heard that name. Like this was on October 11th. And so this was, right after the attacks in Israel. So it was very strange. So I'm standing in this room full of 200 kids, and I'm like, oh no, I have to tell these kids about the Holocaust now. Like, I can't leave this room and not explain. And then I'm also like, I'm in Virginia. It's not a state that loves me. I'm one of the most banned authors in the United States. I'm not proud to say. I'm very disappointed in the fact that that's true of our country. And I was like, am I going to get in trouble for telling these kids about the Holocaust? Like, am I allowed to do this? It was a very strange and unsettling experience. And at the end, this kid, this black boy in the back, raised his hand. He said, would Hitler have wanted to kill black people? And I was like, I had to tell this kid, I'm like, yes, honey, I'm so sorry. Yes, Hitler would have wanted to kill you and your entire family. Like, to say that to a child was, but anyway, obviously, sometimes people say, oh, there's enough books about the Holocaust, and why don't we write, just happier stories, or stories where Jews are heroes, and why are we also writing these stories where bad things happen to Jews? Like, well, I mean, first of all, every story is interesting to me. Like, if you look, again, I would say deep rather than wide. If you tell a specific story in a specific way, that story is interesting, and it's universal in its specificity. And also, apparently kids in Virginia don't know about the Holocaust, so we still need the books. Yeah. Well, I am a banned author because a small but vocal group, you've probably heard, like Moms for Liberty and groups like that, have decided that books that feature either characters who are not straight and not white and center those stories are dangerous to their kids to read, or in my case, books that center girls exploring, for better or worse, their sexuality, sometimes through violent acts, sometimes through empowering acts of pleasure. And either way, they don't like it. And my books are being targeted as pornography. Yeah. I don't think Lilith is functioning anymore. I'm sorry to tell you. I think, they reopened? Because they closed for a little while. I don't. I write I write novels. I mean, I would write if someone asked me to write about my experiences, but I'm not really an essayist. What I really am is a novelist. I've been forced to write essays. In fact, I went to the Huntington Beach. About Huntington Beach and what's happening in Huntington Beach? Oh, gosh. I feel like now I have to tell you guys the same as I tell that poor kid. So the city of Huntington Beach has this terrible city council. This woman, Grace Vandermerk, who's a fascist. She's anti-queer, anti-Semitic. she's just a terrible person. And she and some of the other people on the city council wanted this public library, the librarians, to not be able to make choices about what they put on the bookshelves. Instead, she wanted to give power to the city attorney, who's this one guy, to decide singularly if any book was pornography and if it needed to be removed from the library, which is completely ridiculous, obviously. And so I went and I spoke at this event. It was an absolute circus. It was intensely crazy. The people were screaming pedophile at me. Anyway, I spoke at that, and it passed 4-3, which is the way it was going to pass. And so that is, now a thing that is happening in Huntington Beach, is the public librarians have had their ability to make decisions about their collections taken from them by the city council, which is obscene and ridiculous. So I have to write speeches and I have to write articles about, but it's really gross, I think. I mean, my job is to write novels. I'm very lucky. That's my job. And so to have to spend time doing this thing that I'm not very good at, I don't think, which is speaking up in this sort of public way. Like, I love coming and talking about my books, but defending my books feels, it's scary, I mean, I get really ugly emails now. So I worry when I come to events, in different ways. Sometimes I worry it's gonna be like a Moms for Liberty. Sometimes I worry about, this is my most Jewish book. Sometimes when I was in Boston on the 14th of October, so it was after Israel was, retaliating, and so we were the one Jewish event named in the newspaper that day. It was it was the Boston Book Festival, and our panel was Jewish authors talking about their books. And I looked at that, I thought, we're the one group right now that's in the newspaper as a named Jewish. If someone wants to go, mess with Jews today, they're going to come to my panel at this. So it's just a strange way to walk through the world. I know that other groups of people often have to walk through the world afraid. And so, I mean, I don't think they should have to either, but I don't like it. And I feel worse for teachers and librarians, because I write my books and I stay home, but there are teachers and librarians across the country, even close to home, who are getting hate mail, who are being called pedophiles, who are being having threats made against them and their families for daring to stalk books, including my book. It's a really dangerous and terrible thing that's happening. Yeah, absolutely. Everything is cyclical. Yeah, really. Yeah, it is strange, the cyclicality. It's strange to have this book about cyclicality. It's strange to have this book about this terrible thing that happened on Simchat Torah. There was a thing that happens in my book on that day that I know just happened. So this is and no one's read my book yet when this happened, on the 7th, because my book didn't come out until the 10th. And so just sitting there and it's a weird sort of cyclical experience. It's been a very difficult, it's been a difficult season. Yeah. I think I've dropped to 4th place this season, which is okay with me, but 16. I have 16 individual titles. Everything from, like I said, my young adult novels that explore questions around sexual safety and sexual autonomy, all the way down to a picture book I wrote called What Riley Wore. It's a gentle, loving picture book about a kid named Riley who wears whatever the occasion calls for, and that's it. But Riley is never given pronouns in the book, one way or the other, or the third. No way, no pronouns at all. And people say that it's, I forget what the word is. Grooming. It's grooming. That it grooms children into, alternative lifestyles, which is, it's funny because on the one hand, we sort of books are seen not as very important to, as far as funding libraries and schools, they're sort of seen as not very important or worthy. Library funding is disappearing all over the country, but on the other hand, they're seen as incredibly dangerous at the same time. It's very interesting. Either, I don't know, they're either very powerful or not important at all. So, yeah. Anything else? This is a very exciting, happy conversation. Well, in any case, I very much appreciate you all coming out. I know it's very hard to get people to come out to things I guess they're ever post-COVID in this our new world. And so I'm very grateful when people come out to events. So thank you very much.